I'm an amoeba, pan-fried and then drizzled with a reduction made of 3 ounces orange juice, 1 ounce maple syrup, and a pinch of Himalayan pink salt. Serve me up with a side of scorched collards, and voila, a perfectly imbalanced meal. Kent.
And hi, I'm the official scent of the Canadian people. Oh, Canada. Tony.
Oh, that was bad. Okay.
So bad. So bad.
Can I say that as a Canadian? That was really bad.
Yeah, it was real bad. No, I totally own that.
Okay.
Wow. All right. Thank you for that delightfully odorous introduction, Tony. We are delighted this week to bring you one of our all-time favorite authors working in all of the genres that we love. Sarah Gailey is a Hugo Award winner and an internationally published writer of fiction and nonfiction. Their nonfiction has been published by Mashable and the Boston Globe, and they are a regular contributor for Tor.com and Barnes & Noble. Their most recent fiction credits include Fireside Fiction, Tor.com, and The Atlantic. Their debut novella, River of Teeth, was published in 2017 via Tor.com and was a 2018 Hugo and Nebula Award finalist. Their adult novel debut, Magic for Liars, is stinking amazing and will be published by Tor Books in June, like a week from today, or less than a week from when this podcast goes live, and will be published by Tor Books. So their young adult novel debut, When We Were Magic, will be published by Simon Pulse in spring of 2020. So there's a lot to look forward to. You can find links to their work at sarahgailey.com and find them on social media at Gailey Frey. So Sarah, did you want to go ahead and just provide like a quick introduction to yourself? What did we miss with the highlights that were just provided there?
Hi, I am neither an amoeba nor the official scent of any country. I've been trying for years to get some nation of this earth to pick me up as an official scent. And I don't want to say I'm bitter that it hasn't happened yet because, you know, like every career moves at its own pace. But I'm starting to feel a little bit like Leo at the Oscars.
Was that a pun? I'm starting to feel a little bitter.
Yeah, maybe. Except bitter is more of an actual taste, right? Because you actually have taste buds for bitter, right?
If you think that you can't smell bitter, then it sounds like you've got an attitude problem. And I'm not going to let that hit my morale.
Okay. You know, I feel like as someone who has just recently been turned down by Guinea-Bissau for their national scent, like... I understand you. I understand.
You know, you trained so hard, and then some up-and-comer shows up on the scene, and they just get all the attention for their smell, and it's like... Anyway, we don't have to go into it.
We're feeling a lot of feels here.
It's fine. I'm fine. It's fine. There's no hard feelings. Frankly, it's an honor just to be considered.
All right. So, great and elegant segue here. We are going to talk not just about your amazing works and the work that just about to come out. It's like imminent and you're going to do a book tour about it. But we also wanted to talk about maybe some of the broader questions facing you as an author and facing authors writing in science fiction and fantasy at large. So just to kind of toss this over to Tony, did you want to go ahead and pose our first question?
Absolutely. So I will actually add on to the bio that River of Teeth was also our favorite novella of 2018.
Oh, heck yeah.
You actually won an award for it from us.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Oh my gosh, I remember. That made me so happy. I remember I was having the shittiest day, and then you guys let me know that I was your favorite novella, and I was like, oh, there's light in the world.
Yay.
Oh my God, we're light, Tony. We're light.
That is our next funny intro, that we are light. We are.
Which one of you is a wave and which one of you is a particle?
I'm the particle.
I'm the wave. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The two genders.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, more than two genders.
Down. Quark. Anyway, right. So my question is alternate history. Let's talk about all things alternate history. And here's the biggest question of all time and this podcast. What is alternate history?
We have literally been discussing this for at least a year. What even is it? Does it belong in science fiction and fantasy? What do we do about it?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so if you've been talking about it for that long, please forgive me if I'm like super 101 about it. I mean, the way that we kind of define the genre, right, is that alternate history is like our world, but like if you buy into the one great man theory, you know, of history where all of history is defined by a single event, then that event changes somehow. Mm-hmm. Or if you buy into the idea that all of history is defined by, like, one theme, that theme gets shifted at a pivotal moment. The kind of big famous one that a lot of people talk about is steampunk, where it's like, oh, instead of doing fossil fuels, we did steam power, and everything is made of, like, clockwork, gears, whatever. I think alternate history is kind of, like, you could just take away the word alternate. For a lot of the time. I have this like big high horse that I like to ride around on with a loudspeaker that I yell into about how American history is alternate history, because most of the history that Americans understand about our country and our culture is founded in complete falsehood. And, you know, a refusal to honestly examine any parts of our past. A lot of people write alternate history with really broad strokes about culture and society. You know, things like there were hippos in the swamps of Louisiana, right? I did that one. Okay, that's my alternate history that I'm doing. Yeah. But there's also alternate history in smaller kind of interpersonal cultural norms. Things like I'm reading this stupendous book right now called The 10,000 Doors of January that looks at the early 1900s and openly acknowledges how just abhorrently racist everything in our society and culture was. Books that don't acknowledge that are kind of alternate history. They're you know, a lot of books that take place in the early 1900s where you've got your protagonist walking through the world and not being at every step confronted with the inalienable importance of whiteness in that time. Those are totally alternate histories. Books that pretend that there haven't always been queer people and allies alongside those queer people who are protecting them and supporting them are alternate history.
That's great. And it just kind of, it gave me a little bit of a brain freeze there for a moment where I was thinking, so is alternate history a way to tell truer history in a way?
For me, it is, in my writing. That's why I wrote River of Teeth the way that I did, because it gave me a chance to talk about queer people and people of color in Western narratives where they have always been. Like, the majority of cowboys were not white.
Right.
And if you think that cowboys were not out there, you know, boning down people of their same gender, you are a fool.
Yeah.
I think that the current contemporary interpretation of Western as very heterosexual and male and white, it's like if 100 years from now people were writing punk narratives where people were all bankers by day and punks by night. It really erases a huge part of the actual roots of that culture. And by saying, oh, I'm writing like a crazy hippo story, I also had the opportunity to say, well, listen, if you can bend your imagination that far, you can also imagine that maybe like a person of color exists.
Yeah, totally. And that makes me think too of that Stonewall movie that came out like a couple years ago that was totally like completely whitewashed, and like the person who threw the first brick at Stonewall in the movie was like, you know, a cis white gay male instead of like a black trans drag queen. And like I like, thankfully that movie was panned because that's, you know, Stonewall was recent enough that people were like, yeah, this shit didn't happen this way. But like, it feels like once you get a few generations out, people are totally willing to be like, yeah, all cowboys were like straight manly white dudes.
Absolutely. I mean, and I don't know if it's generational or if it's about the control of the flow of information. Because right now we've got the internet, right? Everybody's talking to each other all the time, and that comes with its own problems. But it's not this thing where the textbooks that you learn history from are tightly controlled by a group of fairly conservative people who live in Texas, and they decide what gets taught in all of the history classrooms throughout the United States. And that's been true for a long time. So if you are living in like the 50s, the history that you come to understand has a really narrow source, and you're not able to go online and find out from other people who know better. There's like no oral tradition of American history that can't be manipulated by American propaganda.
Yeah.
Totally. I feel like we have a very interesting form of double vision right now where we're able to see, because of social media and globalization, that there are like lives out there that are very different from our own and that feel like they're in some sort of parallel universe. I was raised very, very religious, and there's this whole community, the community of my childhood, that is spinning tales about current events in a way that builds a very different narrative from the one that I see and that I'm living through. And so it's really interesting when you think of projecting that backwards, how far can the various histories diverge from one another, and how do you get at what's true? And so what I'm hearing from you, Sarah, is that you can use alternate history and the suspension of disbelief that we as readers are asked to perform in order to essentially sneak more truth in there.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's, when you're giving a dog a pill, you like wrap the pill up in a piece of cheese.
It never works on my cat.
Oh no, cats are nefarious. I had a cat once who would eat the entire like pill pocket from around the pill and then spit the pill in my lap like try again.
Butter is the key.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, just stick her in there and then massage the throat. Butter.
Oh man.
The real stuff.
But yeah, I think that it shouldn't be necessary, and it's not perfect, and it's not like a coherent philosophy of mine, but I do think that in a lot of ways, speculative fiction has always been that piece of cheese that we can wrap an idea up in. And that's what kills me about the discourse that's like, oh, when did science fiction and fantasy get so political? It's like, oh, where have you been?
Yeah.
We've always been using this to talk about things that we're not allowed to talk about, because then Brett Serling can say, oh no, I'm talking about space aliens, not segregation. Don't be silly. I wouldn't talk about something that you don't want me to talk about on television.
Somebody missed out on their Octavia Butler class in college.
No kidding.
So far we've kind of we used genre as a way to talk about something not genre. And I guess I'm curious about whether you were thinking more about genre while you were writing American Hippo and the River of Teeth duology, or were you thinking more about the truths you could tell? Like, what role did genre play in your mind as you were writing?
Oh man, it was both at once. I mean, I was thinking a lot about pulp western. The American Hippo books are a love letter to pulp westerns for me, which is like that's what they are. That's why the characters are so outsized. That's why the world building isn't super explicit and in depth, because it's supposed to be fun. I don't want that to get lost. Like, these books are supposed to be fun to read and like kind of edging on silly, but not silly. But at the same time, I did want to engage with the issues that I think are missing from traditional Western narratives. And that way, it's impossible for me to engage with the genre and be thinking about genre without thinking about what do I want to address with this book in terms of history and the way that some stories are told and some aren't. Because that's what I think about when I think about genre, is what do I have to say in this genre that I think is missing, or even just that excites me and that interests me. So when I was writing River of Teeth, it was very like, oh man, this is so much fun. I definitely am going to have like a poker scene where everybody draws guns on each other. And at the same time, oh, I better make sure that I'm acknowledging the discomfort of the people of color in the scene where like there are people drawing guns on each other, because everyone's going to have a different perspective on what firing that gun might mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like, I have this like headcanon that you have this file of like weird shit from history that you can just like pair with like queer narratives or narratives that don't necessarily get told. So my question is kind of less like, tell me about that, and more like, do you have that, or is this just kind of like, you wanted to use this as a vehicle to tell a bunch of stories, to do a bunch of things at once?
Oh my goodness. I mean, the file of weird moments in history and queer moments in history and weird animal facts and like outer space facts, it's all the same file. It's just my weird brain. I like how little kids get really into one thing and then they want to tell you everything about it. Like they want to like,
yes.
I have a friend who, when she was a kid, her dearest wish was that someone would come up to her and ask her how many dinosaurs she could name. Like,
I still wish that.
I always have felt that way about like everything. I'm just interested in knowing facts, and so that file is just my skull. Mm-hmm. I also, as I've grown more into myself and become more aware of my queer identity and the things that I think that are unexamined, and the more time I spend examining those things, the more I get to learn. Mm-hmm. So stuff like queerness in history, my interest in that comes from, first of all, like having been straight passing for a while, which I am certainly not anymore. Mm-hmm. And then realizing that I was erasing my own queerness in that, and then looking at why that was. And the reason that was so easy for me to do is because history and culture make it easy. And then I was like, okay, well, what am I missing in history? Like all these things that I assume to be straight throughout history that make me feel like a weird new kind of creature. Mm-hmm. Is any of that real? And the answer is like, no, none of it's real. It's all completely fabricated. It's totally freaking made up. Mm-hmm. There's this book that's coming out in a couple of weeks, and I can't remember the name of the author right now, but she just had this big scandal where live on BBC radio, she found out that her understanding of a legal term was wrong. And the legal term is recorded dead, I want to say.
Yes.
And she was writing about how all these queer people were killed by the state for being queer, and for, they call it like sodomy or like, you did gross stuff kind of thing.
Right.
When actually what that term means is that they recorded that the person had been executed and then let them go free. Because they decided you shouldn't die for this after all. Mm-hmm. The idea, the unquestioned idea that you'll get murdered for being queer no matter where you are in history, I mean, it's not wrong. Like, it's a dangerous thing to be a queer person in a straight culture that wants you dead. Mm-hmm. But also, like, there's all these secret pockets of allyship and of safety and of comfort. Mm-hmm. And, like, people are always amazed to learn, like, oh my gosh, there's a whole other gender option in this other country. And it's like, yeah, that's always been there. We've always been here.
Right.
And every time I learn a new thing that's like, oh, there's another way that like historic queerness was allowed. Mm-hmm. I tuck it into that file that is my skull, and I just like savor it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think the author you were thinking of, because this showed up in my Twitter feed earlier in the week, was Naomi Wolf. Does that?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that's her.
Yeah, that was a fascinating example of maybe how not to research your book. She actually handled it really well for finding out that, the last couple of years of her thinking was possibly erroneous.
Yeah, I have got no criticisms for how she handled it. I can't imagine how I would handle it. Just hearing about it made like all of my skin leap off of
I would die.
Totally.
My social anxiety would just completely
go
crazy.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking, the more that we talk in these directions, the more I'm also thinking of Nicola Griffith's novel Hild.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know, it just like, it seems like this is, I honestly, when I put Hild in the show notes, I was like, is this really, like, isn't this more of, like, historical fiction? And now that we've been talking about all of these things, I'm like, this is perfect. This is, like, the re-examination of a character and basically their, like, erased queer life that was, turned into a Catholic morality tale in official histories. And so this is kind of like, what Nicola Griffith did as well, is kind of like getting directly at, like, that truth, the truth that isn't told, the truth that isn't recorded. So I don't know that this is a question so much as, like, I think Hild belongs here too.
Yeah, I'm adding that to my reading list right now.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. It reminds me that when you go that far back in history to something like Hildegard, and you're reconstructing a life that we don't have a lot of paper on, you are essentially already engaging in an act of fabrication and fictionalization. And so to add a queer spin isn't to add anything in there that wasn't there. People have been creating the mythos of Hildegard for centuries. And so what Nicola Griffith did was have the audacity to essentially return queerness to the space that had been erased from all along. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can't, historically speaking, ascribe queerness to Hildegard and substantiate it, but there's a fair number. Tony, we've been talking about this with natural history, mm-hmm. in that a lot of queer people throughout history, it was assumed, it was never stated or recorded in documentation that historians can now draw from and essentially prove queerness. Who is it we were talking about? Alexander von
Humboldt, yes, which is particularly salient for me because, like, my research that I'm working on right now is all about, like, queer folks in the biosciences and how, like, a lot of my interview subjects are like, yeah, I don't know anyone. Like, I don't know anyone directly. I might know, like, other students, but, like, no faculty. I certainly don't know anyone from history. And I teach a class every fall in which I talk a lot about Alexander von Humboldt. And I'm like, holy shit. Like, I've been talking about him all this time, and I didn't know that, he had, like, these queer identities that have completely gone under the radar. And I've been talking about this shit. Like, this is what I'm researching. And I just have never included it in a class. And that just, like, that seems so much the way of it. Like, what is muted? What can you talk about? Like, Arizona, for example, just, I mean, like, in the last month or so, did away with what are called no promo homo laws. I mean, what the ACLU refers to as no promo homo laws, which say basically, in, like, K through 12 public education, teachers are barred from discussing, like, queer people at all, or, like, queer sex, or that, anything queer exists. Like, they just can't talk about it. And Arizona is definitely, like, it's great that that's happened in 2019, and there are plenty of other states in the US, plenty of other places in the world that have similar or more restrictive laws still ongoing. And that just, like, the fact that it's, the fact that such laws and such restrictions not only bar, just like bar existence, I think is, like, the core of it. And that just boggles my mind.
Yeah, and if you bar mention, then you do bar existence down the road in terms of documentation, mm-hmm. which is how we get into this mess in the first place. If we don't know that there's people in history who've been queer, if we can't see that in the documentation, then we feel like we're kind of locked out of this historical narrative, which is not true. It's not true at all. And so that's one of the beautiful things of what Sarah Gailey and Nisi Shaw and some of these other authors who are writing alternate histories, what they're doing is making the space big enough for us to exist in, like we should have all along.
Yeah, I think there's a lie there that queerness is novel and therefore we should be patient as the world figures out mm-hmm. how to cope with it. Mm-hmm. If queer people started existing sometime in the late 80s, mm-hmm. Then, it's understandable that society is taking some time to figure out how to converse with queerness. And So it's like, oh yeah, no, you're right. We shouldn't push so hard. We shouldn't protest so loud because people need time to come around. And there's a lot of support for that narrative because of that, like you said, that lack of documentation. I think there's an argument that is made often that you shouldn't mention queerness, say of people in biosciences. You shouldn't mention it unless it's relevant, because you're not mentioning that they're heterosexual. So why are you bringing up the fact that they're queer? And that argument is a huge pile of trash because it is relevant. It's relevant because if you mentioned that they were straight, no one would bat an eye. And because of things like the no promo homo law, like that makes it relevant. That makes queerness relevant. That makes it part of the conversation by saying like it shouldn't be allowed. You're saying that it matters, and so then we have to look at why that erasure matters, and that's why the erasure matters, because it makes us not look at the history of brutality and violence, because it makes us not look at the history of support, because it makes us not say there's precedent for people being nice to queer people. Yeah, I know. Can you imagine? And I think it's just wild. The straights are wild to me, and I'm just like, guys, what are you? We're all so tired. Do we have to do this?
Very true. So I would love to do a little bit of a shift in gears and talk about Magic for Liars, if I might.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about alternate history and what it allows us to do and what tools it kind of puts in our toolbox. I would also like to mention and talk and ask you a little bit about what it was like kind of doing the same with crime fiction and noir and fantasy and kind of bridging those two things together, which are not, I mean, it's not that it's never happened before in science fiction or fantasy that we've seen noir elements brought in. Like I can think of The Expanse, especially the first book had some elements there. Artemis Fowl had some elements of the PI and investigative fiction. But what you're doing is again, like you're taking these kind of noir crime fiction tropes the way you took Western tropes in River of Teeth and the American Hippo duology, and you're doing something very different with them. And I was just curious, again, was this intentional? And what were you trying to do, if it was?
It was completely intentional. For anyone who doesn't know, Magic for Liars is a novel that is about a non-magical private investigator trying to solve the murder of a faculty member at a high school for magical teens. Her estranged twin sister happens to be a faculty member at this high school. It's very much about like identity and like class and academia and lies we tell ourselves to get through life. And it's like you said, it's a noir fantasy. And I mean, my whole entire life and identity is about questioning assumptions.
Yeah.
You know, I was raised in a society that told me that I was a heterosexual white girl who was going to grow up to be a heterosexual monogamous white woman with children in a house with a college degree that I would use every day of my life and 401k. As with a lot of people in my age bracket, I've had to question a lot of things that my culture told me when I was growing up, working my way backward in terms of like the personal, you know, that 401k doesn't exist, probably never going to exist. Social Security, probably not going to exist either. The atmosphere might not exist, like who knows.
Right.
The planet might.
I would say that my whiteness is immutable, but whiteness is a construct, and, you know, we're living in a time of the rise of fascism, which means that the category of white is likely to shrink over the course of the next few years. In terms of my personal identity, like, monogamous, no. Cisgendered, no. Heterosexual, no. Like, the house, kids, stable office job, it all comes apart. And so when I was approaching this novel, I was like, oh, I know what I want to write. Like, I want to write in the noir genre, and I want to question a lot of things about the noir genre, and I want to write fantasy, and I want to question a lot of things about fantasy, because that's the only way that I really think I know how to engage with things, is like, I look at them and I take them apart, and I'm like, okay, what parts of this actually need to be here? In Magic for Liars, I got to do both of those things at once for both of those genres, for noir and for fantasy. I got to kind of pick at stuff and see what needs to stay and what doesn't, and what we can turn upside down and look at what's underneath it. It was so much fun. You guys, it was so much fun to write, and I'm so excited about it.
Yeah.
Well, it was so much fun to read as well. So I can just confirm that what you felt is what your readers are feeling as well, which is
Thank you.
Great.
I'm so looking forward to it.
Yes. Again, small plug, go out there, pre-order, do all the things you got to do, people. If you can go to the tour that Sarah Gailey is going on, please do. This is definitely a book worth pursuing. That's the plug. Okay. So back to talking about like the toolkit and what noir allows you to do. Like, did you have specific noir or crime influences as you were going into writing this? Like, what was the epitome of crime that you were kind of deconstructing and seeing what worked for you?
I mean, I think this is the first time in my life that someone has asked me to give examples of a thing where my brain hasn't shut down and decided that it's never seen a movie or read a book before. By the way, I just want to say I'm really excited about this. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the epitome of noir for me.
Yes.
Because it is a commentary, because it's engaging with all the noir tropes really heavily in this way that's accessible for people of all ages. And so it's been in my brain like forever. I mean, Jessica Rabbit was, I think, my first crush. Mm-hmm. And also will be my last crush, by the way, was my dying breath.
I'm here for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's evergreen. Obviously, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is engaging with this huge, rich history of noir and like crime pulp and like, detective fiction. And there's a lot to draw from. I was fortunate enough to get to do like a literature and film studies class when I was a teenager, and we did this whole big noir unit where we were watching all of the classics of noir. And I was engaging with those individual films and individual books, but more than that, I was engaging with the genre as a whole and what the genre has to say. I think that noir is very much about isolation and brokenness. It's about marginalization. It is about the parts of culture that we don't want to engage with, and it kind of forces us to engage with them. And in this book, I wanted to do that, but I also wanted to look at the way that noir fails in that engagement, with great love and affection for the genre, by the way. Mm-hmm. You know, when you think of a PI in classical noir, you think about a guy who drinks a lot and he's alone, but he's not lonely. He's the I work alone cop. And he sees the seedy underbelly of everything, and it doesn't affect him because he thinks of himself as worse than anything. Mm-hmm. Mm. And as someone who is deeply traumatized and, you know, struggles with all the mental health issues that comes with that, I wanted this book to look at that part of noir that's like, what does it do to a person? What does it do to you to think that you are the worst of all the horrible things you see? Mm-hmm. And then what happens if you're in a fantasy world and you can see what the thing that you think is the best would be like?
And so when I think of like Maltese Falcon or, you know, Casablanca, etc., some iconic noir films, I think of them as saying something very specific about the nature of humanity. Like, people don't change, and ultimately you're going to end up right back where you started. And that's the tragic hero place, I guess. And yet your book, Magic for Liars, very definitely embraces the idea that people can change, or that progress can happen in your, you know, damaged relationships. That's definitely featuring in the book. So I guess I'm curious, like, what do you think that you were trying to say about the nature of humanity in the midst of or underneath all of these genre conventions and all the tools that you were using? Like, what was that for you?
Oh, man. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say that I can remember what my exact thought process at the time was when I was writing it, but I can tell you what it is now and try and retroactively give myself credit for...
Totally.
It's in there.
I think that there's there's noir and there's fantasy that lean into that idea that a person's nature is immutable. Like this like kind of racist fantasy thing of like, oh, the race of elves all have this personality type.
Right.
Orcs are all evil.
Right. I think that idea is fascist. Mm-hmm. I think the idea that a person's identity and value and values and personhood are immutable is almost always used negatively in these lights, right? It's not the thing of like, you have value no matter who you are or what your body is doing or who you're in love with. It's the idea that like you're born into a certain way of being and you stay that way forever. Mm-hmm. The dame who comes into your office and is like, I'm in a pickle and you gotta help me out of it, and you're suspicious of her, you're right, because she is bad and she's always been bad and she's always going to be bad. Mm-hmm. Again, don't get me wrong. Jessica Rabbit, I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way. Formative to my entire life. But the idea that people can't change makes us lean into things like capital punishment.
Yeah.
And it ignores restorative justice and it ignores the plasticity of a personality. Mm-hmm. In Magic for Life, I deal a lot with teenage identity because it takes place at a high school. It's an adult perspective, but the setting is at a high school. Mm-hmm. And the way that the people who we are when we are teenagers shifts from day to day. Yeah. And the people who we are when we're adults also shifts from day to day. The idea that you set and then you're one kind of person for the rest of your life is, I think, ableist and homophobic and transphobic and inherently supports these fascist ideas of a person's worth being established early on and being immutable, and therefore it's okay to say, well, you're never going to change, so our society should discard you.
And it reminds me too of, I mean, we can't have an episode where I don't talk about Star Trek, and
it's true.
as much as I like Star Trek, like it's guilty of that so often in all of its incarnations, where like all Klingons are this way, all Vulcans are this way, all Betazoids are this way, and
until they're not,
and there are subversions, especially in Deep Space Nine, but on the other series as well, where you get characters who go against the grain, but it is this very like this really uncomfortable, like, biological determinism, which I'm glad you're calling it fascism. Like, call it what it is. And it is that. And it's so important to be better. And I would say one of my critiques of the newest Star Trek series, Discovery, is that it doesn't necessarily do that as often as it should. For all of what it does well, like, this is still something that we, like, speaking in cultural and societal we's, and more specifically, like, speaking in, like, science fiction and fantastical we's, all of these we's need to do better with this.
Yes. And I am not going to be mad at the original Star Trek for its politics on a lot of levels, because I think it's important to remember, and I say this for me, not, like, you gotta remember this. I find it important to remember the historical context of the boundaries that are being pushed.
Yes.
And, it's really easy for me, especially, and for a lot of people in my community, to look back at something like the original Star Trek series and go, what is going on with your politics?
Yeah, right.
But also, they're pushing boundaries in a lot of ways, and I want to respect that and uphold that, while still, as you said, trying to do better. And that goes in with personal identity too, right? I want to look back at the person who I was 5 years ago and go, oh, some of your politics were bad and some of your decisions were stupid, but I know that you were doing your best, and the important thing is that I do better than that person.
Yeah.
Part of the juicy character stuff that I really liked writing in Magic for Liars was that failure to do better.
Yeah.
And the way that we as people, just like we as a society, can deceive ourselves into thinking that we're doing the best we can when really we are doing what the new Star Trek series is doing and failing to push ourselves to be better.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to, when you give yourself permission to become a different person or look back at your history, your personal history, and say, and notice that you were a different person in the past, that allows you to, in a sense, make peace with past mistakes. You can acknowledge that it was you who made them, but then also move forward and transform and perform better identities, essentially, or more suitable identities, or more fitting, I guess. Yeah, I find this notion of performance really interesting in the context of Magic for Liars, because a lot of the characters in your book are performing themselves. There's perfections that they add to their hair color or their eye color or their skin clearness or so on and so forth. And so they're in essence reinventing themselves all along. And I love that your book never reams them out for these perfections. The non-magical character is deeply uncomfortable with these moments of performance, but there isn't any name calling over it, at least in the present of the book. There might have been in the past of the book. There's a history there.
Yeah, I try really hard and, fail often. But I try really hard to maintain a sense of empathy and compassion for the characters that I'm writing. It's one of the biggest things I've learned over the course of my writing career is that if I write a character without empathy for who they are and what they're trying to accomplish, the character is going to be flat and shitty. And that can be fun sometimes, but it doesn't make a good book if there's a villain who doesn't think that they're doing the right thing, or if there's a misguided character who doesn't think that they're doing the right thing, even if they're lying to themselves, even if they're lying to the reader narratively. Just like I try to have compassion for people in my life who, are mean or are cruel or are, let me down in some way. Doing that for my characters and doing that for people who I know in real life makes it harder to construct a narrative that ignores their humanity. And I think that the less that we write narratives that ignore the humanity of people, the better our stories will be, and the more we'll learn to see humanity in people in our actual lives. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. It's the first time I've ever tried to articulate that out loud.
I think you did a brilliant job for the first time.
Yeah. I have this thought, again, this is not quite a question yet, that alternate history is, in addition to kind of like what we've been saying about telling truths, telling different truths, telling truer truths. I don't really necessarily want to say that, but what we've been saying. I threw this word emancipatory into our notes, like emancipatory fiction, and I brought up Everfair by Nisi Shaw, like Ken said, A Secret History of Witches by Louisa Morgan, The American Hippo duology, Lady Astronaut, that series by Mary Robinette Kowal.
So good.
I wonder, what are these works doing? Like, what is going in one end and what's coming out the other?
That's a great way to put it. I think it depends on the work, and I think that this actually drills down to the marrow of things that annoy me about some alternate history and not others, is that question of what are you doing?
Yeah.
There's some alternate history that just like reinforces colonialism, right? Like the kind of steampunk that's like, well, this guy's wearing like jodhpurs and khakis and a pith helmet. Isn't that a neat aesthetic? Well, ignoring the fundamental, like the root of that as really severe colonialist imperialism. That kind of alternate history is like, okay, you're having fun, but at whose expense and at what cost? And I think that the alternate history that I like that doesn't irritate me is I don't know if I would say emancipatory, but that's just because there's a lot of historical context in the U.S., especially for the word.
Totally.
But but like that idea that you are trying to untangle some historical bullshit is, I think that's the alternate history that I like and respect.
Yeah.
It's not just examining what if stuff was bad in a different way, but it's examining the assumptions that we make about our history and, you know, where we come from as a culture, as a country, as a world. I really admire that work.
I'm thinking too, one of the first alternate histories that I read while thinking about alternate histories as a category of things was Kim Stanley Robinson's The Years of Rice and Salt.
Yes. Oh, I can't believe I didn't think about that.
And you know, here's a really interesting, sort of weird, slightly uncomfortable, but slightly awesome work. You know, it's written by a white man who's professedly a white man with you know, his experience is limited by his experience, who's attempting really intentionally to kind of examine some of those points in history where colonialism has gone, well, colonialism is itself wrong, but like colonialism gone wrong and how it's affected other cultures, and then trying to, without dwelling on the negative, you know, look at some of the joys of welcoming other people back into history. I don't know, have either of you guys read that book?
Absolutely.
I haven't, but it sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I love that book. It's great. It's enormous. It's like an 800-page brick, but it's covering like 1,200 years of history. So,
oh, I'm so into it.
It's a great pairing with Tristan Palmgren's Quietus if you're looking for massive tomes.
Yeah.
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share as we segue out of the podcast today?
I have two categories of closing thought. The first one is like mercenary, because my publicist and agent will kill me if I don't do it.
Yeah.
Magic for Liars comes out on June 4th. You can buy it anywhere books are sold, in audio, ebook, or print. I hope you do buy it. Also, I've got a 15-city tour in June. If you live in a city that exists in the United States, please go check out sarahgailey.com to look at tour dates and see if you can come to an event and say hi, and I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. It can be inanimate, it can be animate, I don't care. I have Sharpies and they will work on anything.
If your cat needs a signature, bring your cat.
Absolutely. My other closing thought that's less mercenary is this conversation has just made me think about how important it is that the stories we tell and the narratives that we tell fight existing structures of oppression. And if you have a story that you want to write and you think that you can't write it because it's too much of something that the history of our culture has told you is wrong and bad and not allowed, write it.
Yeah.
We need those stories so much, and every single one that goes out into the world makes the world better.
Yeah.
I love that so much.
Snaps.
And so again, you can find out more about Sarah Gailey at www.sarahgailey.com. And I believe it's on your website that they can sign up for your newsletter. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct.
Okay, there's a twice-a-month newsletter that is, I guess, a recent-ish invention. So go ahead and sign up for that for more news on Sarah Gailey and their wonderful, wonderful works. You can also listen, as I did and marathoned it, totally. Fisher of Bones is on Serial Box, and the entirety of it, at least for right now, is available on Serial Box for free. So if you're looking for a little bit of audible storytelling in your life, that's a definite must check out. And you can also find their wonderful books wherever good books are found. So go forth, find Sarah Gailey's works.
Yes.
Tony, where can you find out more about us?
You can find out more about us in the place where you cannot see, you cannot hear, you cannot smell, cannot taste. No, you can find out about us on the internet. So go to Imaginaries.net. We're also on Twitter at imaginary_pod. And if you would like to email us, which we always welcome, that is imaginarypod@gmail.com. And wherever you are listening to this podcast is the place where you can listen to our other episodes. Yes, which we do have to say, iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube are our standards, but we are also now on Spotify and where else?
Stitcher.
Yes, that one. Yeah. Yes, well, let us thank, so many thanks to Sarah Gailey for being with us on this episode. You are the very first person we thought of when we were like, we want to have guests. You are, at the top of our list. This is so cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a complete delight.
This was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. We will certainly have more unless we don't, but we will. So, for now, I'm so jet lagged right now.
So, in the meantime, we'll catch you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, so
I love jazz.
So okay, no, here's my question.